Hello and welcome to this new lecture. So this is the first lecture of the second part of the course, and today we're going to talk about deponent and semideponent verbs. They are not difficult to study and to learn, and you will find them very often. So it is important that you know how to translate them. So let us see what deponent verbs are and why they are called this way. So deponent verbs are verbs with a passive form, but with an active meaning. The name comes from the Latin verb deponere, which means to put down, basically because they abandon their active forms. This kind of verbs does not exist only in Latin because Proto-Indo-European and Ancient Greek also have a corresponding voice, which is called the middle voice. The deponent verbs are nothing else than the middle voice, but transposed in Latin. So this means that when you identify a deponent verb, you have to translate it with an active form, even though it is passive. Good news is that you do not have to learn new forms, because if you know the passive voice properly, which we studied in the first part of the course, you consequently know how to deal with a deponent verb. You just have to translate it with an active voice. So something that changes and that needs to be remembered is that the principal parts of a deponent verb have a passive form, but you will just find 3 of them and not 4 as in a normal verb. So I will call a normal verb everything that is not like deponent or semideponent. This means that it is really easy to distinguish a deponent verb from a normal one, because you just need to look at their principal parts. If it has 4, it is a normal verb, but if it has 3, like in this case, it is a deponent verb. So in this example, I give you a very frequent deponent verb, hortor, hortari, hortatus sum, which means to encourage, to exhort. So as you can see, the first voice, the first principal part is the present indicative, and we know that. The second principal part is the present infinitive, while the third principal part and the fourth principal part in deponent verbs are basically put together. So as you can see, hortatus sum represents the perfect indicative, but since the perfect indicative already contains the past participle, basically the 2 principal parts are fused together. So that is why you find 3 principal parts in deponent verbs and not 4. Let us give an example of a conjugation. So I did not conjugate all the verbs, because if you know the passive conjugation, then you perfectly know how to conjugate a deponent. The only thing that you have to remember is that you have to translate it with an active form, not with a passive one. I give you the example of hortor, the verb that I used in the previous example. So I will read the present indicative. Hortor, hortaris, hortatur, hortamur, hortamini, hortantur. As you can see, the forms of the verb are passive, but in the translation, I need to put the active form. So it is not I am encouraged, but for example, it is I encourage, and so on. You encourage, he encourages, we encourage, you all encourage, they encourage. Same thing for the perfect indicative. We have hortatus sum, for example, and I have to translate I encouraged, so with an active voice, and not I was encouraged. And so on with all the other persons. I know that this is not an automatic process because we do not have deponent verbs in modern languages, but I don't think it's difficult to understand the mechanism. It is difficult to become acquainted with that. And I think that the best way to do that is to practice and to translate as many deponent verbs as you can. You will find deponent verbs very frequently, so it's important to know how to translate them. We also have semideponent verbs. So semideponent verbs are particular verbs because they behave like normal verbs in the present system and like deponent verbs in the perfect system. They have 3 principal parts as well, but the first two have an active form, because the first two are related to the present system, while the third one, which is the one that behaves like a deponent and is related to the perfect system, has a passive form. As you can see, the principal parts are the same of the deponent because there are three. But the first two are related to the present system and the third one is related to the perfect system, and you will find it with a passive voice. So for example, I put this verb which means to dare, to be brave enough. So audeo, I dare, audere, to dare, aususu sum, I dared. But since this is related to the perfect system, I cannot translate with a passive, because it behaves like a deponent verb. So I must translate with I dared and not I was dared, because it wouldn't be correct. So semideponent verbs are really easy to learn because they're just 6. Audeo, gaudeo, soleo, fido, confido, and diffido. And they all belong to the second and third conjugation. I think it is very important for the semideponents to memorize the principal parts because sometimes they can be tricky. They might look like a normal verb, but in the end they are semideponents. So I think that if you memorize the principal part, it's going to be a great advantage for you when you translate the sentences or just the text. Lastly, I will give you an example of how a semideponent conjugation works. So basically it works normally for the present system, while for the perfect system you have to remember that the forms are passive, but you have to translate them with an active meaning. So let's look at the present indicative first. Audeo, audes, audet, audemus, audetis, audent. So with this one, no problem, we can translate it literally. I dare, you dare, he dares. We dare, you all dare, they dare. But with the perfect indicative, everything changes, because I must remember that the perfect system in a semideponent verb behaves like a deponent verb. So for example, we have ausus sum, ausus es, ausus est, ausi sumus, ausi estis, ausi sunt. But I cannot translate with the passive because I have to remember that I must turn it to the active voice. So I dared, you dared, he dared. We dared, you all dared, they dared. Even for the semideponent verbs, it is really easy to remember them because they're 6. But in order to get acquainted with them, I think that the best way is just to practice and translate as many as possible. Okay, this is all I had to say. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in class.